In the shadowed halls of medieval Europe, a child's innocence was bartered for power, her fate sealed by the cold hands of politics and ambition. Isabella of France, a mere girl of 12, was thrust into a marriage with a king twice her age, her small frame trembling under the weight of a crown she never chose. This is not a fairy tale of romance, but a harrowing saga of a princess caught in a web of dynastic schemes, her life a pawn in the brutal chess game of 14th century royalty. Her story, steeped in tragedy and resilience, begins in the opulent courts of France, where the seeds of her destiny were sown amidst whispers of war and alliance. Listen closely, for the tale of Isabella, known to history as the She-Wolf of France, is one of heartbreak, betrayal, and a fierce will to survive. To understand Isabella's plight, we must step back into the turbulent world of the early 1300s, a time when Europe was a patchwork of warring kingdoms, and marriage was a weapon as sharp as any sword. Isabella was born in 1295, the only surviving daughter of King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, a ruler whose iron grip on power was matched only by his ruthless ambition. France, under Philip's reign, was a land of immense wealth and influence, its coffers swollen with the spoils of crusades and the church's reluctant tributes. Yet, it was also a kingdom under constant threat, bordered by the restless ambitions of England, with whom tensions simmered over disputed territories like Gascony and Aquitaine. A marriage alliance, Philip reasoned, could secure peace or at least a temporary truce with the English crown, and who better to offer than his own daughter, a living symbol of French prestige? Isabella, as a child, knew little of these machinations. Her early years were spent in the gilded cage of the French court, surrounded by tutors, ladies-in-waiting, and the ever-present shadow of her father's will. Described by chroniclers as strikingly beautiful even in youth, with fair skin and luminous eyes, she was a treasure to be guarded and ultimately to be traded. Her brothers, the heirs to the French throne, were groomed for power, while Isabella's role was clear from the start. She was to be a bridge between nations, her body and future a currency for diplomacy. In 1303, when she was just 8 years old, negotiations began for her betrothal to Edward, Prince of Wales, the son of England's formidable King Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. This union was to be the linchpin of a fragile peace treaty, a desperate bid to end decades of bloodshed over French lands held by the English crown. Across the Channel, England was a kingdom forged in conquest and strife. Edward I, a towering figure of military might, had spent his reign crushing rebellions in Scotland and Wales, his ambition to unite the British Isles under one crown matched only by his need to secure his continental holdings. His son, Edward of Carnarvon, born in 1284, was a stark contrast to his father, a young man more enamored with courtly pleasures than battlefield glory, whose rumored personal inclinations and close male friendships would later scandalize the realm. Yet, as heir to the throne, his marriage was a matter of state, not sentiment. The betrothal to Isabella was finalized in 1303, though the wedding was delayed until both were of a more suitable age, or so the official records claimed. In truth, the delay was a calculated move, a chance for both kingdoms to assess the shifting tides of power before committing to the union. By 1307, the landscape had changed. Edward I died, leaving his son to ascend as Edward II, a king ill-prepared for the burdens of rule. His coronation was marred by whispers of incompetence and the growing influence of his favorite, Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose arrogance alienated the English nobility. Meanwhile, in France, Philip IV pressed for the marriage to proceed, eager to bind his daughter to the English throne and secure a foothold in their politics. Isabella, now 12, was deemed ready to fulfill her destiny. In January 1308, she set sail across the stormy Channel, a child bride accompanied by a retinue of French nobles, her dowry a glittering array of gold and jewels meant to dazzle the English court. But beneath the pomp lay a grim reality. Isabella was leaving behind her family, her home, and any semblance of childhood, stepping into a foreign land where she would be queen in name, but little more than a political hostage in practice. The historical backdrop of Isabella's early life is crucial to understanding the forces that shaped her. The rivalry between France and England was not merely territorial but deeply personal, rooted in centuries of Norman conquest and contested claims to the French throne. The Capetian dynasty, under Philip IV, sought to centralize power, often clashing with the papacy and the Templar order, whose wealth Philip famously plundered. England, under the Plantagenets, clung to vast swathes of French territory, a legacy of Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry II. This tangled web of lineage and land made Isabella's marriage a linchpin in a precarious balance, her very existence a symbol of potential unity or catastrophic conflict. As she arrived in Dover on a cold winter's day in 1308, greeted by a husband who barely acknowledged her beyond formal courtesy, the weight of these expectations must have been crushing for a girl so young. Yet, even in these early moments, there were hints of the strength that would define Isabella's later years. Chroniclers note her poise during the wedding ceremony at Boulogne-sur-Mer, her small hands steady as she swore vows in a language she barely understood. She was crowned Queen of England alongside Edward II in Westminster Abbey, a spectacle of grandeur that masked the underlying tensions. The English barons, already wary of Edward's rule, eyed the French princess with suspicion, while her husband's attention remained fixed on Gaveston, who was granted honors that should have been hers. Isabella, though a child, was not blind to these slights. Her education in the French court had taught her the art of observation, the necessity of patience. But how long could patience hold in the face of neglect, humiliation, and the growing storm of political unrest? The early years of Isabella of France's life as Queen of England were a bitter education in powerlessness, a stark contrast to the glittering promise of her coronation. At just 12 years old, she had crossed the Channel with dreams of influence, perhaps even affection, only to find herself marooned in a court that viewed her as little more than a decorative pawn. Her husband, Edward II, was a king whose heart and attention were elsewhere, fixated on his favorite, Piers Gaveston, a man whose presence at court was a festering wound to both Isabella's pride and the English nobility's patience. The year was 1308, and the seeds of discord were already sprouting in the cold stone halls of Westminster, where whispers of discontent grew louder with each passing day. Isabella, though young, could sense the undercurrents of hostility, her sharp mind cataloging every slight, every dismissive glance, as she navigated a world that seemed determined to crush her spirit. Edward II's obsession with Gaveston was no mere rumor. It was a public scandal that humiliated Isabella from the moment she arrived. At their wedding feast, Edward had barely spared her a glance, instead lavishing attention on Gaveston, who sat in a place of honor that should have been reserved for the new queen. Chroniclers of the time, such as the author of the Vita Edwardi Secundi, recorded the outrage of the assembled nobles, who saw this as an insult not just to Isabella but to the sanctity of the crown itself. Gaveston, a Gascon knight of modest birth, was showered with titles and lands, including the earldom of Cornwall, a gift that enraged the barons who had long served the Plantagenet dynasty. Isabella, still a child in many ways, was forced to watch as her husband's affection meant to secure her position became a weapon of exclusion. Her dowry, meant to cement her status, was mismanaged or outright ignored, leaving her dependent on Edward's whims for even basic expenses. The English court was a viper's nest of competing ambitions, and Isabella quickly learned that she had few allies. The barons, led by powerful figures like Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's cousin, viewed her as a foreign interloper, a symbol of French influence they distrusted. Her youth and inexperience made her an easy target for their scorn, and her inability to speak fluent English in those early years only deepened her isolation. Letters from the time, preserved in French archives, hint at her loneliness, as she wrote to her father, Philip IV, pleading for guidance or simply a kind word from home. But Philip, ever the pragmatist, offered little comfort. His daughter's marriage was a political tool, and her personal suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of France. Isabella was trapped between a husband who neglected her and a family who saw her as a means to an end, her role as queen reduced to a hollow title. As the years crept by, the political situation in England deteriorated, and Isabella's position grew ever more precarious. By 1312, when she was just 17, the barons' resentment of Gaveston boiled over into open rebellion. They demanded his exile, and when Edward refused, they took matters into their own hands, capturing and executing Gaveston in a brutal act of defiance. Edward's grief was palpable, his rage directed not just at the barons but at the very institution of monarchy that constrained him. Isabella, now a young woman, watched this unfold with a mix of fear and quiet calculation. Gaveston's death removed a personal humiliation, but it did little to mend her relationship with Edward, who seemed to blame everyone but himself for his loss. Worse still, it plunged England into a state of near civil war, with Edward's authority crumbling under the weight of baronial opposition. Isabella's own status as queen was further undermined by her inability to produce an heir in those early years, a failure that was unfairly laid at her feet by a court eager to find fault. Medieval society placed immense pressure on royal women to secure the succession, and though she was still young, whispers of infertility began to circulate, adding to her shame. In truth, Edward's disinterest in her likely played a significant role, as their marriage remained more ceremonial than intimate. Yet, in 1312, a glimmer of hope emerged when Isabella gave birth to a son, the future Edward III, a child who would one day reshape the destiny of both England and France. The birth was celebrated, but it did little to warm Edward's heart toward her. Instead, it seemed to bind her more tightly to her role as a vessel for dynasty, her personal desires and dignity cast aside. Beyond the personal slights, Isabella faced the broader challenge of navigating a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Edward II's reign was marked by military failures, most notably the disastrous defeat at Bannockburn in 1314 against the Scots under Robert the Bruce. This loss not only humiliated England but also emboldened the barons, who saw Edward's incompetence as a threat to their own power and safety. Isabella, as queen, was expected to stand by her husband, yet she could not ignore the growing chorus of dissent. Her French upbringing gave her a keen understanding of politics, and she began to forge quiet alliances with those who might one day prove useful. She corresponded with her family in France, seeking their counsel, and cultivated relationships with certain English nobles who saw her as a potential counterbalance to Edward's erratic rule. But these efforts were fraught with danger. Any hint of disloyalty could brand her a traitor, and her foreign status made her an easy scapegoat for England's woes. The tension between her duty as queen and her instinct for self-preservation grew with each passing year, a tightrope she walked with increasing dread. By the late 1310s, as she entered her early 20s, Isabella was no longer the naive child who had arrived in Dover. She had endured neglect, witnessed rebellion, and borne the weight of a crown that offered no protection. The conflict within her marriage and within the kingdom was rising to a fever pitch, setting the stage for a dramatic turn in her fortunes. What would it take for this young queen to break free from the chains of her forced marriage, and at what cost would she claim her own power? By the early 1320s, Isabella of France, now in her late 20s, had endured over a decade of a marriage that was more cage than crown. The young girl who had arrived in England with a child's hope for a fairy tale queenship was long gone, replaced by a woman hardened by neglect, humiliation, and the relentless grind of a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. Her husband, Edward II, remained a king in title but not in strength, his rule undermined by military defeats, baronial rebellion, and his own inability to govern. Isabella, as queen, was caught in the crossfire, her position increasingly precarious as she became a target for both her husband's indifference and the court's growing resentment. This was a period of profound decline for her, not marked by physical imprisonment but by an emotional and political confinement that suffocated her spirit and threatened her very survival. The personal toll of her marriage was evident in every interaction with Edward. After the birth of their first son, Edward III, in 1312, and 3 more children in the following years, Isabella had fulfilled her primary duty as queen, securing the succession. Yet, even motherhood, a role that might have brought her some solace or influence, was tainted by Edward's disinterest. He rarely engaged with her or their children, his attention instead consumed by a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, who had risen to prominence after Piers Gaveston's death. Despenser, a cunning and ambitious noble, wielded immense power over Edward, far surpassing the influence Gaveston had ever held. Unlike Gaveston, whose arrogance had been personal, Despenser's actions were calculated and ruthless, alienating even the most loyal of Edward's supporters. For Isabella, Despenser's presence was a fresh wound. He not only monopolized her husband's affections, but also actively worked to diminish her status, intercepting her funds and restricting her access to court resources. This financial and social strangulation was a form of imprisonment in itself. Isabella, once the daughter of one of Europe's wealthiest kings, found herself stripped of the means to maintain her household or assert her authority as queen. Letters from the period reveal her desperation as she appealed to her brother, now King Charles IV of France, for support, detailing how Despenser had confiscated lands and revenues that were rightfully hers. The English barons, many of whom had initially distrusted her as a foreigner, began to see her as a fellow victim of Despenser's tyranny, though their sympathy was tinged with political opportunism rather than genuine care. Isabella's isolation deepened. She was a queen without a court, a wife without a husband, and a mother whose children were often kept at a distance by the very man who sought to control every facet of Edward's reign. Politically, England's state mirrored Isabella's personal decline. Edward II's disastrous policies and military failures continued to erode his authority. The loss at Bannockburn in 1314 had been a blow, but his inability to manage internal dissent was even more damaging. By 1321, the barons, led by Thomas of Lancaster, launched the Despenser War, a direct rebellion against Edward's favorites. Though the rebellion was crushed and Lancaster executed in 1322, the victory was hollow. It only entrenched Despenser's power and further fractured the kingdom. Isabella watched as her husband's rule became a parody of monarchy, with Despenser acting as the true king in all but name. Her own position was undermined at every turn. Rumors circulated that Despenser spread tales of her disloyalty, painting her as a French spy to justify her marginalization. For a woman raised in the sophisticated and calculating court of Philip IV, this was a bitter pill. She knew the game of politics, yet found herself powerless to play it. The emotional weight of this decline was crushing. Chroniclers of the time, though often biased against her due to later events, note a marked change in Isabella during these years. The vibrant, poised young queen seemed to fade, her public appearances growing rarer as she withdrew into a shell of quiet endurance. Her children, particularly her eldest son Edward, became her anchor, yet even they were pawns in the larger game, their upbringing often dictated by Despenser's whims rather than her own. The psychological toll of being sidelined in her own marriage and kingdom must have been immense, a slow torture of irrelevance that gnawed at her pride and resolve. Yet, beneath this surface of resignation, a spark of defiance remained. Isabella was not merely a victim. She was a survivor, biding her time, observing the cracks in Edward's regime with the keen eye of someone who had been taught to seize opportunity from chaos. Her decline reached a critical point in 1325, when an unexpected chance for escape presented itself. Tensions between England and France had flared over the disputed territory of Gascony, and Edward, under pressure from Despenser, was reluctant to travel to France to pay homage to Charles IV for the lands he held there. Instead, Isabella was sent as an emissary, a decision that likely stemmed from Despenser's desire to be rid of her influence, however diminished it was. This journey back to her homeland was a turning point, though not yet a triumph. Arriving in Paris, Isabella was greeted with warmth by her brother and the French court, a stark contrast to the coldness she had endured in England. For the first time in years, she tasted freedom, however fleeting, and the seeds of rebellion began to take root. She refused to return to England immediately, citing fears for her safety under Despenser's dominance, a claim that was not without merit, given his growing paranoia and cruelty. This act of defiance, though subtle, marked the beginning of the end of Isabella's imprisonment, both literal and figurative. In France, she was no longer just a neglected queen, but a figure of potential, a woman with royal blood and a claim to influence. Yet, even as she breathed the air of temporary liberation, the weight of her past and the uncertainty of her future loomed large. Could she transform this moment into true power, or would she remain forever trapped by the chains of her forced marriage? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, in a storm of betrayal and bloodshed that would soon engulf both kingdoms. In the spring of 1325, Isabella of France stood on the precipice of a transformation that would echo through history, her heart a battleground of fear, resolve, and long-suppressed fury. Having arrived in Paris under the guise of a diplomatic mission to negotiate peace over Gascony with her brother, King Charles IV, she found herself tasting a freedom she hadn't known since childhood. No longer under the suffocating control of Edward II or the malevolent influence of Hugh Despenser, Isabella began to weave a plan that would shatter the chains of her forced marriage. This was no mere act of defiance. It was a calculated rebellion, a desperate bid to reclaim her dignity and secure her son's future. The stage was set for a climax that would be as bloody as it was unforgettable, a turning point that would brand her forever as the she-wolf of France. Isabella's time in France was a revelation. Surrounded by the familiar comforts of her native court, she was no longer the sidelined queen but a figure of royal blood, respected and valued. Her brother Charles, though bound by political considerations, offered her a sympathetic ear, and the French nobility rallied around her, sensing an opportunity to destabilize their English rivals. It was here that Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English baron who had fled to France after leading a failed rebellion against Edward II in 1322. Mortimer, a man of military prowess and burning ambition, shared Isabella's hatred for the Despensers and her disillusionment with Edward's rule. Their alliance, forged in mutual need, quickly deepened into something more personal. Rumors of a romantic entanglement swirled, though chroniclers of the time are divided on the nature of their bond. What is certain is that together they became a formidable force, plotting not just to return to England but to overthrow the king who had wronged them both. By late 1325, Isabella made a bold decision. She would not return to Edward's side as commanded. Instead, she publicly declared that she feared for her life under Despenser's influence, a claim that resonated with many who knew of his cruelty. This act of refusal was a direct challenge to Edward's authority, and it sent shockwaves through both kingdoms. Edward, enraged, demanded her return, while Despenser tightened his grip on the English court, confiscating what little remained of Isabella's lands and resources. But Isabella was undeterred. With Mortimer's counsel and the tacit support of the French court, she began to gather a small but determined army of exiled English nobles and mercenaries, funded in part by her brother's coffers and her own dowry jewels. Her son, Edward of Windsor, the young heir to the throne, was summoned to France under the pretext of paying homage to Charles IV for Gascogne move that ensured his safety and positioned him as a key piece in her strategy. The plan crystallized in the summer of 1326. Isabella and Mortimer, with a force of fewer than 2,000 men, set sail for England, landing on the Suffolk coast on the 24th of September. Their arrival was a lightning strike, catching Edward and Despenser off guard. Isabella's banner flew high, proclaiming her intent to liberate England from the tyranny of the Despensers, and she issued proclamations framing her invasion not as treason but as a righteous crusade to protect her son's inheritance and the realm's honor. The response was staggering. The English people, weary of Edward's misrule and Despenser's greed, flocked to her side. Barons who had once scorned her as a foreign queen now saw her as a savior, and towns opened their gates without resistance. London itself, the heart of Edward's power, erupted in riots against the king, with mobs lynching Despenser's allies in the streets. Isabella's march was less a military campaign than a tidal wave of popular support, her years of suffering now a rallying cry for a nation desperate for change. Edward and Despenser fled westward, hoping to muster loyal forces, but their cause was doomed. By November, they were captured near the Welsh border. Despenser was dragged before a makeshift tribunal in Hereford, where Isabella and Mortimer oversaw his fate. The trial was a spectacle of vengeance. Despenser was charged with treason, tyranny, and crimes against the Queen herself. On the 24th of November, 1326, he was subjected to a gruesome execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered in full view of a jeering crowd. Chroniclers describe Isabella watching impassively, her face a mask of cold satisfaction, though whether this was true resolve or a shield for inner turmoil, none can say. Edward, meanwhile, was imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle, stripped of power but not yet of life. The climax of Isabella's rebellion had arrived, a moment of brutal triumph that saw her transform from a neglected child bride into a queen who wielded the sword of justice or retribution. Yet this victory was not without its shadows. Deposing a king, even one as despised as Edward II, was a dangerous precedent, and Isabella knew the weight of what she had done. On the 25th of January, 1327, Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III, in a ceremony marked by tears and coercion. Isabella, now regent alongside Mortimer, held the reins of power, but at what cost? The execution of Despenser and the humiliation of her husband were acts of catharsis, yet they stained her reputation, whispers of cruelty and ambition beginning to taint her name. The English chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker later wrote of her as a woman driven by unnatural passions, a narrative that would grow in the centuries to come. In this moment of climax, Isabella stood at the height of her power, but the seeds of her own downfall were already sown in the blood and betrayal of her rebellion. The winter of 1327 cast a cold shadow over England, a kingdom reeling from the seismic upheaval orchestrated by Isabella of France. With Edward II deposed and imprisoned, and her son, Edward III, crowned as king at the tender age of 14, Isabella stood as regent, a queen mother wielding power, in a realm that had so long denied her any. Alongside her ally and rumored lover, Roger Mortimer, she held the reins of a fractured nation, her forced marriage now a distant memory replaced by the bitter taste of hard-won authority. Yet, this triumph was no fairy tale ending. It was a precarious perch atop a mountain of resentment, betrayal, and blood. The aftermath of her rebellion would reveal the true cost of her actions, as the very power she had fought to claim began to slip through her fingers, staining her name in the annals of history. In the immediate wake of Edward II's abdication, Isabella and Mortimer faced the daunting task of stabilizing a kingdom on the brink of collapse. The young Edward III's coronation on the 1st of February, 1327, was a symbolic fresh start, but real power rested with the Regency Council, dominated by Isabella and Mortimer. Their first acts were pragmatic, securing loyalties through rewards and pardons for those who had supported their cause, while ruthlessly purging remnants of the Despencer faction. Yet, the specter of Edward II loomed large. Though imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, his existence as a living former king posed a threat, a potential rallying point for dissenters. In September 1327, news emerged of his death under mysterious circumstances, officially attributed to natural causes but widely rumored to be murder, a gruesome act involving a red-hot poker, according to later sensationalized accounts. While no definitive evidence links Isabella directly to this deed, contemporary whispers and later chroniclers pointed fingers at her and Mortimer, casting a dark pall over her rule. Whether she ordered it or merely turned a blind eye, the stain of regicidy or the suspicion of it clung to her, a burden she could not shake. Governing England proved as challenging as seizing it. Isabella and Mortimer's regime was marked by heavy-handed tactics that alienated even their former allies. Mortimer, elevated to Earl of March, amassed wealth and influence, his arrogance echoing the despised Despensers, while Isabella herself was criticized for lavish spending, including a substantial dowry for her daughter's marriage. Their foreign policy faltered too. A humiliating peace treaty with Scotland in 1328, known as the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, recognized Robert the Bruce's independence, a bitter pill for a nation still smarting from Bannockburn. Meanwhile, tensions with France simmered, as Isabella's ties to her homeland raised suspicions of divided loyalties. The English barons, who had once cheered her as a liberator, grew restless under what they saw as a new tyranny, their grumbling a warning of storms to come. Isabella, once a victim of neglect, now faced accusations of overreach, her every decision scrutinized through the lens of her gender and foreign birth. The most significant blow to her power came from within her own family. Edward III, though young, was no mere puppet. Raised amidst the chaos of his father's reign and his mother's rebellion, he inherited both Isabella's sharp intellect and a fierce determination to rule in his own right. By 1330, at just 17, he had grown weary of Mortimer's dominance and his mother's complicity. In a swift and decisive coup at Nottingham Castle in October of that year, Edward, with the aid of loyal nobles, arrested Mortimer under cover of night, charging him with treason and usurpation. Isabella, caught off guard, pleaded for mercy for her ally, but her influence was shattered. Mortimer was executed without trial, hanged at Tyburn on the 29th of November, 1330, a public humiliation that echoed the fate of Despencer. Isabella was spared harsh punishment, perhaps due to her son's filial piety or fear of further unrest, but she was stripped of power, confined to a quiet life at Castle Rising in Norfolk with a generous allowance. The queen who had toppled a king was now a figure of the past, her regency a brief, tumultuous chapter. The immediate legacy of Isabella's actions was a mixed tapestry of triumph and tragedy. On one hand, she had secured the throne for her son, laying the groundwork for Edward III's long and transformative reign, which would see England assert itself as a major European power through the early stages of the 100 Years' War. Her rebellion had also exposed the fragility of unchecked royal favorites, a lesson not lost on future monarchs. Yet, her personal reputation suffered grievously. Contemporary chroniclers, often writing under the influence of later political biases, painted her as a manipulative, vengeful woman, a narrative amplified by the lurid tales of Edward II's death. The moniker, she, Wolf of France, first attributed to her in later centuries, captured this duality: ferocious strength paired with predatory cruelty. Her story became a cautionary tale of feminine ambition, a lens through which medieval society grappled with the rare spectacle of a woman wielding such raw power. In the years following her fall from grace, Isabella lived out her days in relative obscurity, dying in 1358 at the age of around 63. She was buried at the Greyfriars Church in London, reportedly clad in her wedding cloak, a poignant symbol of the marriage that had defined and nearly destroyed her life. Her son, Edward III, honored her memory with a grand tomb, yet history was less kind, often reducing her to a footnote in the saga of Plantagenet kings. The institutions she influenced, from the English monarchy to the delicate balance of Anglo-French relations, bore the imprint of her actions, yet her personal narrative was overshadowed by the scandals of her regency. As the centuries passed, her story was alternately vilified and romanticized, a testament to the complexity of a woman who defied the constraints of her time at immense personal cost. As the dust of rebellion settled over medieval England, Isabella of France's life drew to a quiet close, far removed from the tempest of power and betrayal that had once defined her. Retiring to Castle Rising in Norfolk after her fall from regency in 1330, she lived out her remaining decades in relative seclusion, a once mighty queen reduced to a spectator of the kingdom her son, Edward III, would shape into a formidable power. Her death in 1358, at the age of around 63, marked the end of a saga that began with a child bride's forced marriage and crescendoed into a rebellion that toppled a king. Yet, as we reflect on Isabella's journey, the question lingers like a shadow over history. Was she a victim of her circumstances, a villain driven by vengeance, or a visionary who dared to defy the chains of her time? Her story, steeped in tragedy and triumph, refuses to be neatly categorized, challenging us to look beyond the labels of she-wolf and see the woman beneath. Isabella's life was a crucible of medieval womanhood, forged in the fires of political necessity and personal suffering. Born as a pawn in the dynastic games of France and England, her forced marriage at 12 to Edward II was not just a union of crowns but a sentence to isolation and neglect. Enduring years of humiliation under her husband's indifference and the tyranny of his favorites, she bore the weight of a queen's title without its power, her spirit tested by a court that scorned her foreign roots. Yet, from this crucible emerged a resilience that history cannot ignore. Her rebellion in 1326, alongside Roger Mortimer, was a seismic act of agency, a rare moment when a woman seized the reins of destiny to depose a king and secure her son's throne. Though her regency was brief and marred by missteps, it shattered the illusion that a queen could only be a silent consort, setting a precedent however controversial for female influence in a male-dominated world. Isabella's actions remind us that power, even when grasped with bloodied hands, can be a form of survival, a desperate cry against the suffocation of subjugation. But at what cost did this power come? The aftermath of her rebellion painted a portrait of a woman whose victories were as cursed as her defeats. The suspected murder of Edward II, whether by her command or mere acquiescence, branded her with a legacy of cruelty, a stain that chroniclers and playwrights would amplify over centuries. Her fall from grace at the hands of her own son, Edward III, in 1330, was a bitter Ironia mother who had fought to secure his crown was cast aside as he claimed his own authority. Confined to a life of quiet retirement, Isabella watched as her name became a byword for ambition gone awry, her story twisted by those who feared the specter of a woman wielding a scepter of her own making. Later accounts, from the chronicles of Geoffrey Le Baker to the dramatic retellings of Christopher Marlowe, often reduced her to a caricature of feminine malice, ignoring the context of her suffering and the constraints of her era. In this light, Isabella's tragedy is not just personal but cultural, a reflection of a society unprepared to grapple with a queen who refused to be merely ornamental. Her legacy, however, is not solely one of infamy. Isabella's influence rippled through the reigns that followed, most notably in the assertive rule of Edward III, whose claim to the French throne partly through her Capetian blood ignited the 100 Years' War. a conflict that reshaped Europe. Her defiance, though vilified, planted seeds of change, whispering to future generations of women that power was not solely a man's domain, even if the price was steep. In modern scholarship, there is a growing effort to reclaim Isabella from the shadows of misogynistic historiography, to see her not as a she-wolf but as a survivor navigating a brutal landscape with the tools she had. Her life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the intersection of gender and power in the medieval world, where a woman's strength was often her greatest liability. Was Isabella a monster, as some would have us believe, or a mirror held up to a society that forced her into impossible choices? As we close this chapter on Isabella of France, her story lingers as a haunting melody of what might have been. Buried in her wedding cloak at Greyfriars Church in London, she rests as a symbol of both the fragility and ferocity of human will. A child princess who became a queen of rebellion, only to be forgotten by the very history she helped shape. Her tale is not just a footnote in the Plantagenet dynasty, but a piercing reminder of the personal toll of political games, the silent screams of those sacrificed on the altar of alliance. What do we make of a woman who, in breaking free from one cage, built another of her own making? Her life raises questions that echo even today about agency, morality, and the price of defying destiny in a world that demands obedience. If Isabella's journey has stirred something in you, whether it's awe at her courage or unease at her choices, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below with your reflections on her story. Do you see her as a tragic heroine, a ruthless opportunist, or something in between? Have you encountered other historical figures whose legacies are as contested as hers? Let's keep this conversation alive, diving deeper into the shadows of history where figures like Isabella challenge everything we think we know. And if you're hungry for more tales of forgotten queens and turbulent reigns, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next chapter of the past brought vividly to life.